I never expected one night of babysitting to change my life forever, but when Ryan looked at me that way, like I was something he couldn't bear to lose, I knew there was no turning back. How do you walk away from something that makes you feel alive again? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a tale filled with secrets, betrayal, and forbidden desire. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The moment I heard Ryan's voice over the phone, something inside me fluttered. It was a simple request, just babysitting for the night, but the way he asked, the way his voice held a softness he rarely showed, made my stomach tighten. I had no idea that one favor would change everything. The evening had been dull, much like every other night in my house. Mark sat in his usual spot on the couch, eyes glued to the television, barely acknowledging my presence. It had become our routine: silent dinners, cold goodnights, and the suffocating presence of a man who no longer saw me. I should have been used to it by now, but each night, the loneliness pressed heavier against my chest. When my phone rang, I practically leapt at the sound. Any distraction was better than the dull monotony of my life. Seeing Ryan's name on the screen made my lips curve into a small smile. My nephew, though grown now at 22, had always been one of my favorites in the family. He was young, charming, and despite his struggles as a single father, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that was hard to ignore. "Aunt Alicia, I need a favor," Ryan said, his voice smooth, slightly hesitant. "Of course," I replied without thinking. "What's up?" "Could you watch Emma for a few hours tonight? I've got an important meeting and my usual sitter canceled on me last minute." The request was simple, innocent, but something about his voice, the way he lingered on his words, sent a shiver down my spine. I ignored it, brushing the feeling away as nothing more than my mind overanalyzing things. "Of course," I said again, softer this time. "I'd love to." Mark barely reacted when I told him I was heading over to Ryan's place. He grunted in acknowledgement, his focus never leaving the glowing screen in front of him. I stared at him for a moment, waiting for some sort of protest, a hint of jealousy, anything that would prove he still cared. But nothing came. Disappointment settled deep in my stomach as I grabbed my purse and keys. The drive to Ryan's apartment was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the radio. My mind drifted, unbidden, to the last time I had really looked at him. He had grown so much over the years. No longer the lanky teenager I had watched over during family holidays, but a man with broad shoulders, strong arms, and a gaze that sometimes felt a little too intense when it met mine. I shook my head, exhaling sharply. What was wrong with me? When I pulled up to his apartment complex, Ryan was already waiting at the door, dressed in dark jeans and a fitted button-up. He looked sharp, effortlessly put together, a stark contrast to the exhaustion I had seen on him before. His hazel eyes locked onto mine, and for a second, I felt a strange heat crawl up my spine. "Thanks for coming," he said, smiling as he stepped forward to open the door for me. "No problem," I managed, forcing a small laugh. I missed Emma anyway. The inside of his apartment was simple but cozy, a mixture of baby toys and scattered papers, showing the chaos of a young single father doing his best. The scent of baby lotion and faint cologne lingered in the air, an oddly comforting combination. Emma, his 6-month-old daughter, lay peacefully in her crib, her tiny fists curled near her face. My heart softened at the sight of her, the innocent rise and fall of her chest, pulling me into a quiet sense of calm. "He just went down," Ryan said, stepping beside me, his voice close. "Shouldn't be too much trouble. But if she wakes up, a little rocking usually does the trick." I nodded, suddenly hyper-aware of how near he was, how his body heat radiated against my skin. It was ridiculous, inappropriate even, but I couldn't help the way my breath caught for just a moment. Ryan chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I owe you for this. Maybe I can take you out to dinner sometime, just as a thank you? I swallowed hard, my heart skipping a beat. You don't have to do that. I want to, he said, his voice softer, almost intimate. For a split second, there was something unspoken in his gaze, a hesitation, a question. But before I could decipher it, he broke away, grabbing his coat. I shouldn't be gone long, he said, his tone shifting back to casual. Make yourself at home. And just like that, the moment passed, leaving me standing in the dim nursery, my pulse racing for reasons I didn't understand. The apartment felt too quiet after he left. I settled onto the couch, flipping through channels, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan. The way he looked at me, the way his voice lingered just a little too long on certain words. I shook my head, exhaling sharply. No, stop it. This is just babysitting. And yet, as I sat there in the dim glow of the television, I couldn't ignore the way my stomach twisted with a feeling I didn't want to name. The apartment was eerily quiet after Ryan left, save for the occasional soft sighs of baby Emma in her crib. I settled onto the couch, tucking my legs beneath me as I tried to focus on the television, but my thoughts drifted. The room carried a faint trace of his cologne, mixing with the warmth of baby lotion and soft fabric. It was a scent that lingered, comforting yet dangerously intoxicating. I forced myself to focus on the screen, flipping through channels mindlessly. The remote felt heavy in my hands, my fingers tightening around it as my mind replayed Ryan's last words to me. Maybe I can take you out to dinner sometime, just to thank you. The way he had said it, soft but lingering, had stirred something inside me I didn't want to name. It was absurd. He was my nephew, my sister's son, and I was a married woman. There was no reason for my pulse to race the way it had when he smiled at me. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head as if I could physically dispel the thoughts creeping in. It was just babysitting, that was all. A small cry from the crib broke the silence, pulling me from my thoughts. I quickly stood, padding over to the nursery, where Emma stirred in her sleep, her tiny fists rubbing against her eyes. "Shh, sweet girl," I whispered, carefully lifting her into my arms. Her warmth spread through me, a reminder of when my own son was this small, back when Mark still looked at me like I mattered, back when our life was full of love instead of indifference. I rocked Emma gently, humming softly as her whimpers died down. She nestled into me, her tiny fingers grasping the fabric of my sweater, and my heart clenched. "You're so precious," I murmured, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. As I swayed with her, my eyes wandered across the nursery. It was simple but well kept. A small bookshelf stocked with bedtime stories, a rocking chair in the corner, and a handful of framed pictures on the dresser. I stepped closer, my curiosity getting the best of me. One of the photos caught my attention immediately, a picture of Ryan and me from years ago when he was still a teenager. We were at a family gathering, laughing at something off camera. My arm was wrapped around his shoulders, his smile wide and genuine. I traced the edges of the frame with my fingers, my chest tightening. "I want to," he had said when I told him he didn't have to take me to dinner. Why did that moment feel heavier than it should? Emma let out a tiny sigh against my chest, her breath warm through my sweater. I swallowed hard, forcing the thoughts away, as I gently laid her back in her crib. I needed to get a hold of myself. Returning to the living room, I curled up on the couch, pulling a blanket over my lap. I needed distractions, anything to keep my mind from wandering into dangerous places. I scrolled through my phone absent-mindedly, but my attention kept drifting back to the way Ryan looked at me before he left. It had been a small thing, barely noticeable, but now, alone in the quiet of his apartment, it gnawed at me. Had I imagined it? A sharp knock on the door startled me from my thoughts. My pulse jumped, and I quickly sat up, my breath catching in my throat. Ryan wouldn't be back yet. It was too soon. For a brief, ridiculous moment, I thought about ignoring it, but then the knock came again, a little firmer this time. Slowly, I made my way to the door, hesitating for a second before unlocking it. Standing on the other side was Ryan's friend Caleb, a face I had seen at a few family gatherings over the years. He was holding a small paper bag and a six-pack of beer, his expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable when he saw me. Oh, he said, blinking. Hey, Alicia, didn't expect you to be here. I forced a polite smile. Babysitting for Ryan? Caleb nodded, glancing inside the apartment. Right, I was just dropping this off for him. He said he'd be home later, though. I reached for the bag, but Caleb hesitated, his gaze flickering over me briefly before handing it over. His eyes lingered just a little too long, and I shifted uncomfortably. Thanks, I said, eager to close the door. But before I could, he smirked slightly. You know, Ryan talks about you a lot. My breath hitched. What? He looks up to you, says you're one of the few people who's always had his back. Caleb shrugged, but there was something knowing in his expression. Just thought you should know. I forced a tight laugh. Well, I'm family, of course I'd be there for him. Caleb said, his smirk deepening. Family? My stomach tightened, my heart suddenly beating too fast. Before I could respond, he gave me a nod and turned to leave, walking down the hallway without another word. I shut the door quickly, pressing my back against it as I exhaled shakily. What the hell was that? I set the bag down on the counter, my hand slightly unsteady as I opened it. Inside was a pack of cigarettes, a bottle of whiskey, and a folded-up note. I hesitated before unfolding the paper. Need this more than ever tonight, thanks, man. A strange, uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. Why would Ryan need this tonight of all nights? I tried not to overthink it. Maybe he was just stressed. He had a lot on his plate. Still, the weight in my chest remained. I curled back onto the couch, trying once again to focus on the television. But Caleb's words lingered, looping in my head like a whispered secret. Ryan talks about you a lot. Just thought you should know. A part of me wished I hadn't opened the door, because now my thoughts felt dangerously close to unraveling something I wasn't ready to face. The sound of keys jingling outside the door made my breath catch. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Ryan wasn't supposed to be home for at least another 2 hours. My heart pounded against my ribs as the front door creaked open, and he stepped inside, his expression unreadable. I sat up quickly, adjusting the blanket over my lap, trying to appear casual. You're back early, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Ryan shut the door behind him, his fingers briefly pressing against the wood as if steadying himself. His hazel eyes locked onto mine, the weight of his gaze sending an unfamiliar heat through my body. Yeah, he murmured, shrugging off his jacket. Things didn't go as planned. I frowned, noting the tension in his posture. He seemed unsettled. The same man who had left with an easy confidence now looked troubled, restless. Everything okay? I asked, keeping my tone light. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his tousled hair. Not really. His voice was lower than usual, rougher, tired. I hesitated before shifting on the couch, making room for him. Want to talk about it? For a moment he didn't move. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he walked over and sank onto the couch beside me. The closeness of him was suffocating in the worst and best way. His shoulders slumped as he leaned back, rubbing his palms together. He let out a humorless laugh. It's stupid. I turned slightly, my knee brushing against his thigh. That tiny contact sent a spark up my spine. Ryan, it's not stupid if it's bothering you. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the bag Caleb had dropped off earlier. His fingers curled around the bottle of whiskey inside. but he didn't open it. I tensed. "Ryan, I just needed to get out of there," he admitted, rolling the bottle between his hands. The whole night I felt off, his jaw clenched slightly, like I was in the wrong place. I swallowed hard, ignoring the way my pulse hammered violently against my throat. "Why?" Ryan turned his head slowly, his gaze pinning me in place. "Because I kept thinking about you." A sharp inhale got caught in my chest. My entire body froze, every nerve going taut under his scrutiny. "Ryan," I whispered, shaking my head, though I wasn't sure what I was denying. He let out a bitter chuckle, his eyes dropping to his lap. "See? I knew I shouldn't have said anything." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. My heart slammed against my ribs, my brain screaming at me to shut this down, to say anything that would break the intensity thickening between us. But I couldn't, because deep down, in a part of me I didn't want to acknowledge, I didn't want him to stop. The silence stretched between us, heavy and loaded. Then Ryan sighed and ran a hand down his face, shaking his head. "Forget it. I'm just tired." I should have let it go. I should have pretended like he hadn't just said the one thing that had sent my world tilting off its axis. But instead I reached out before I could stop myself. My fingers brushed over his hand, still gripping the whiskey bottle. He stilled. A slow, shuddering breath left him as his eyes lifted to mine again. This time, there was no hesitation in his gaze. "Alicia." His voice was barely a whisper, but it sent fire racing through my veins. I should have pulled away. I should have stood up, created space, done something, anything, but what I did next. Instead, I let my fingers rest against his, my pulse hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. "I'm here," I murmured, my voice betraying me. "You can talk to me." Ryan exhaled slowly, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. His free hand lifted, hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers brushed against my wrist. It was such a small touch, barely even a real one, and yet it sent my body into a spiral of confusion and heat. "I don't think talking is what I need right now," he admitted, his voice rough and quiet. I stopped breathing. The air between us was different now, thicker, heavier, dangerous. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I was imagining this. Maybe I was reading into things that weren't there. Maybe this was all in my head. But then Ryan shifted, his body turning toward mine, his knee pressing against the side of my thigh. His fingers moved slightly, barely tracing the skin of my wrist, but it was enough. Enough to send a wildfire through me. I should have pulled back. I should have put an end to this before it spiraled into something unforgivable. But I didn't. Because for the first time in years, I felt seen. I felt wanted. And that terrified me more than anything else. Ryan's breath was warm against my skin as he murmured, "Tell me to stop." I parted my lips, the words forming somewhere deep in my mind. But they wouldn't come. Instead, my body betrayed me, leaning in slightly, just enough to feel the heat radiating off of him. Ryan's fingers curled around my wrist, his grip not tight but firm enough to make my breath stutter. "Tell me," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I still couldn't, because I didn't want him to stop. The realization sent a tidal wave of guilt crashing over me, but it wasn't strong enough to drown out the intoxicating pull of him. I knew this moment could change everything, that once we crossed this line there would be no going back. But as Ryan's lips parted slightly, his breathing just as unsteady as mine, I realized something even more terrifying. I didn't care. The room was impossibly quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the heater and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Time felt like it had slowed, trapping us in a moment that neither of us knew how to escape from. Ryan's fingers were still wrapped around my wrist, warm, steady, holding me in place. I should have pulled away. I should have created distance, reminded him of who we were to each other. But my body refused to move. Every nerve in me was awake, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. My breathing was shallow, my skin burning where his touch lingered. Ryan's gaze flickered between my eyes and my lips, hesitation etched across his face. His grip loosened slightly, but he didn't let go. "Alicia," he murmured, voice rough, unsteady. "I shouldn't be saying this." My stomach twisted, a mixture of nerves and anticipation swirling in my chest. "Then don't," I whispered, though I knew it was a lie. I wanted him to say it. I needed him to say it. His thumb brushed gently against my pulse, and I felt the way my heartbeat raced beneath his touch. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice barely above a breath. "I know it's wrong, but I don't." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I don't know how to ignore it anymore." A sharp tremor ran through me, as if my body was responding before my mind could catch up. His words sent a wave of warmth down my spine, melting the last bit of resistance I was clinging to. "This is crazy," I whispered, even as I leaned in slightly, barely closing the space between us. Ryan gave a soft, breathy chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "I know." His fingers slid from my wrist to my palm, his touch deliberate, as if testing how far I'd let this go. "But tell me you don't feel it too." I wanted to. I wanted to deny it, to pretend that I wasn't burning for something I had no right to want. But the truth sat heavy on my tongue, refusing to be swallowed. Instead, I let my fingers curl around his, the act so subtle, so slight, but it changed everything. His grip tightened just a fraction, his thumb brushing against the inside of my palm, slow and deliberate. My breath hit. Ryan's other hand came up, hovering near my face as if he wasn't sure if he should touch me. His fingers flexed, barely grazing my jaw before he let them fall away. "Alicia," he murmured again, my name sounding like something forbidden on his lips. I didn't stop him when he leaned closer. Our breaths mixed, the air between us growing impossibly thick. I could feel the warmth of him, the scent of his cologne mingling with something undeniably masculine, intoxicating. My body was betraying me, my pulse pounding as his hand finally made contact, fingers grazing the side of my neck, his touch light but searing. I should have said something, I should have stopped this before it started. But instead I closed my eyes, allowing myself to feel, just for a moment, a single, fleeting moment where nothing else existed but us. Then Ryan did the one thing I knew would shatter whatever restraint I had left. He exhaled shakily, and then, so softly, so hesitantly, it was almost like a whisper. His lips brushed against my cheek. My eyes flew open. It wasn't a kiss, not fully, but it was a promise of something undeniable, something waiting at the edge of everything I had been desperately trying to resist. Ryan didn't move, his lips hovering just near my skin, waiting, giving me a chance to pull away. I didn't. Instead, my fingers tightened around his. Ryan sucked in a sharp breath, his grip on me tightening in response. He shifted slightly, his nose brushing along my cheek, the barest hint of his lips grazing the corner of my mouth. It was maddening. "Alicia." His voice was so low, so deep, I felt it more than I heard it. And God help me, I turned my face just enough so that my lips finally met his. It was hesitant at first, a mere brush of mouths, a testing of boundaries we had already crossed the second we allowed this moment to happen. But then Ryan made a sound deep in his throat, a sound filled with something raw, something desperate, and suddenly all hesitation vanished. His hands slid up my arms, fingers curling into my skin as his lips pressed more firmly against mine. I gasped into the kiss, the sensation overwhelming, electrifying. Every part of me was alive. I didn't realize I had been gripping his shirt until he moved, shifting to pull me closer. Everything about this was wrong, forbidden, dangerous. But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Ryan pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine, both of us breathing hard, caught in the gravity of what we had just done. His fingers traced my jaw, his touch reverent, almost aching. "Tell me you don't want this," he murmured, his voice filled with something vulnerable. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out, because the truth was, I did. I wanted him so badly it terrified me. Ryan must have seen it in my eyes, because something in his expression shifted, darkened. He leaned in again, but this time his lips didn't meet mine. Instead, he pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to the corner of my jaw, then just below my ear. A shudder ran through me, my entire body trembling at the feel of his mouth on my skin. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, lips grazing dangerously close to my pulse. I should have put an end to this before it spiraled into something neither of us could take back. But the words wouldn't come, because stopping was the last thing I wanted. Ryan's lips lingered against my skin, his breath warm as it fanned over my neck. I should have pushed him away, stopped this before it went too far, but my body betrayed me. My fingers tightened against his shirt, my pulse hammering in my ears. "I can't," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was telling him to stop or confessing that I couldn't make myself let go. Ryan's hand slid slowly up my arm, his fingers tracing along my shoulder before settling against the nape of my neck. His touch was gentle, reverent, like he was memorizing the shape of me. "You don't have to fight it," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. A shudder ran through me. I knew this was wrong. I knew if I gave in, there would be no turning back, and yet every fiber of my being was desperate to close the space between us, to feel something real for the first time in years. Ryan's other hand slid down, resting lightly against my waist. His touch wasn't forceful, but it was firm enough to anchor me in place. His lips brushed against my jaw again, soft and deliberate, and I felt my entire body react. A small gasp escaped me, and I hated how much I needed this, how much I needed him. "Ryan," I whispered, barely able to form the word. He paused, his forehead pressing against mine, his breath uneven, shaky. "Say the word, Alicia," he murmured. "Tell me to stop, and I swear I will." But I didn't say it. I couldn't, because for the first time in so long I felt wanted, needed, cherished. Ryan must have seen the answer in my eyes because his grip on me tightened. A groan rumbled deep in his throat before his mouth found mine again, this time with an urgency we could no longer suppress. I melted against him, my fingers sliding into his hair as the kiss deepened, hotter, hungrier. This wasn't just a kiss, it was a breaking point. Years of loneliness, of silent nights with a husband who barely looked at me, of pretending I didn't crave more, it all crashed down in this moment, in Ryan's touch, in the way he held me like I was something he had been starving for. His hands roamed my body carefully, exploring without rushing, as if he was savoring every inch of me. The feeling of his palms pressing against my waist, my back, made me dizzy with need, with longing, with something I couldn't name. I gasped as he pulled me onto his lap, his fingers gripping my hips like he couldn't stand the idea of space between us. "This is insane," I murmured against his lips, but my body was already responding to him, moving, shifting closer. Ryan chuckled, though there was nothing light in his tone. "I know." His voice was thick, gravelly with want. "But tell me you don't want this." I couldn't. Instead, I kissed him again, deeper this time, my hands clutching at his shoulders, my body pressing fully against his. A deep groan rumbled through his chest as his hands slid up my back, his fingers tangling in my hair as he tilted my head back, taking control of the kiss. I had never been kissed like this before, like I was something precious, something to be devoured and cherished at the same time. Heat pooled in my stomach, my breathing ragged as his lips trailed down my throat, slow and torturous.
"Good, Alicia."
He rasped against my skin, his voice filled with desperation, restraint, hunger. My name on his lips sent a shock wave through me, made me ache in ways I had long forgotten. I gripped his shirt, clinging to him like he was the only thing keeping me grounded. His hands trembled slightly as they explored my body, his touch hesitant, like he was afraid of pushing too far, afraid I would disappear. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not tonight. Not when I finally felt alive again. I pulled back just enough to look at him, my breath coming in sharp gasps. His hazel eyes were dark, filled with something raw, something dangerous. And yet beneath it all there was something else. Something tender, reverent. It wasn't just desire, it was something more. Ryan reached up, cupping my face in both hands, his thumbs brushing against my cheekbones with a softness that made my chest tighten. "This isn't just a moment to me," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "It's never been just a moment." My throat went dry, because I knew exactly what he meant. I had felt it too. For years, I had ignored it, buried it, convinced myself it was just admiration, just familial closeness. But now, with his hands on me, his lips swollen from our kisses, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Ryan wasn't just my nephew. He was the only person who had ever truly seen me. I should have felt guilty. I should have stopped this before it consumed us. But all I could think about was how much I wanted him, and how, no matter what happened after tonight, I could never undo this moment. I didn't want to. Ryan's fingers tightened on my hips, his breath ragged as he searched my face, waiting for permission, waiting for me to either break this or give in completely. I answered him the only way I could. I kissed him again, harder, deeper, final. And just like that, the last line between us shattered. Ryan's breath was uneven, heavy, his hands gripping my waist like he was afraid I might change my mind. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not when I felt this alive, this wanted, this utterly consumed by something I had no control over. I kissed him again, deeper, harder, my body pressing into his as if I could erase the years of distance, of restraint, of denial. A deep groan rumbled through his chest as he pulled me closer, tighter, his fingers digging into my hips, grounding me to him. My mind was a blur, my body responding before my thoughts could catch up. "This is crazy," I whispered against his lips. But my hands were fisting the fabric of his shirt, refusing to let go. Ryan chuckled, his lips brushing over my jaw, down my neck, leaving a trail of heat and hunger in their wake. "Yeah," he agreed, his voice rough, gravelly with restraint. "But I don't care, do you?" I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. Did I care? Should I? Mark hadn't touched me like this in years. He barely looked at me anymore, barely acknowledged my presence. I had spent so long convincing myself that I was content, that this was just what marriage became after a while. But Ryan, God, Ryan was undoing me. "No," I finally admitted, my voice breathless, shaky. "I don't care." His grip tightened. "Then stop thinking." And then he kissed me again, harder this time, with a kind of hunger that left no room for second thoughts. I gasped into his mouth as he lifted me effortlessly, shifting me beneath him on the couch. His hands roamed my body with a reverence that sent shivers down my spine, igniting something I hadn't felt in years. Every touch, every press of his fingers, every slow, deliberate caress made me ache in ways I hadn't even realized I was capable of anymore. "Tell me if you want me to stop," Ryan murmured against my skin, his lips trailing down my collarbone, his fingers brushing the hem of my sweater. I should have said yes. I should have stopped this before we did something that couldn't be undone. But all I could do was pull him closer, tighter, my breath coming in ragged gasps as his hands explored, memorized, claimed. I wasn't supposed to want this. I wasn't supposed to need this, but I did. So I let him take his time, let him worship every inch of me, let myself forget, even for just this moment, that this was wrong. Because in his arms, I didn't feel like a neglected wife. I felt like a woman again. I arched against him as his hands slid beneath my sweater, slow, careful, almost hesitant. His fingers were warm against my skin, sending a delicious shudder through me. "Alicia," he groaned, his forehead pressing against mine as he tried to catch his breath. "God, I want you." My stomach tightened, the raw, undeniable need in his voice unraveling me completely. "I'm yours," I whispered before I could stop myself. Ryan cursed under his breath before kissing me again, deeper, more desperate this time. There was no more hesitation, no more restraint. We had already crossed the line, and there was no turning back now. The morning after, a soft golden light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. My body was wrapped in tangled sheets, in the scent of Ryan, in the aftermath of something that should never have happened. For a moment, I didn't move. I just lay there, breathing him in, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. It had been slow and intense, tender and consuming. Ryan had touched me like I was something precious, cherished, adored, like I was his. I turned my head slightly, my eyes landing on his sleeping form beside me. His arm was draped over my waist, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, his face peaceful, content. A sharp ache bloomed in my chest. What had I done? The reality of the night crashed over me like a tidal wave, drowning me in guilt, in confusion, in something far worse than regret. Because I didn't regret it. I should have, but I didn't. Ryan shifted beside me, his arm tightening around me as if he could sense my thoughts, as if he already knew I was slipping away. "You're thinking too much again," he murmured, his voice gravelly with sleep, pressing a soft kiss against my shoulder. A shiver ran through me. "Ryan." He hummed in response, his fingers brushing against my bare skin, a reminder of the night before. I swallowed hard, trying to quiet the storm raging inside me. "I should go," I whispered, but even as I said it, I didn't move. Ryan's eyes flickered open, hazel and heavy with sleep. He watched me for a long moment before reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. "You don't have to," he said simply, but we both knew I did. I slipped out of bed, careful not to look at him as I reached for my clothes. Every movement felt too loud, too final, too much like I was trying to erase what had just happened. Ryan sat up, running a hand through his messy hair, watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "You regret it," he finally said, his voice quieter this time. I paused, my hands trembling as I buttoned my blouse. I should have lied. I should have told him that this was a mistake, that it was nothing but a fleeting moment of weakness. But I couldn't, because no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't bring myself to regret him. So instead I just whispered, "I don't know." Ryan let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. Okay. I turned to leave, my hand gripping the doorknob tighter than necessary. Asha, he called softly, making me pause. I didn't turn around. Last night wasn't just a mistake to me, he admitted. It was everything. Tears burned behind my eyes as I forced myself to open the door. And then, before I could change my mind, I walked away. I drove home in silence, the early morning sun spilling golden light over the empty streets. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my breath shallow and uneven. I had done something irreversible. My body still ached from Ryan's touch, the ghost of his fingers, his lips, his warmth woven into my skin like a brand. The scent of him lingered faintly in my hair, in the creases of my clothes. And with every inhale, a fresh wave of guilt tightened in my chest. I had crossed a line, one I could never uncross. Mark would be home soon. He'd expect me to be the same woman he left behind when he packed his bags for yet another business trip. But I wasn't the same. I wasn't sure I'd ever be again. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribcage. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the house, at the life I had built with Mark, the life I had just betrayed. A cold chill ran through me. How was I supposed to walk inside and pretend nothing had happened? Taking a shaky breath, I stepped out of the car, forcing my legs to move even though every step felt like walking into a lie. The house was still, quiet, almost eerily so. I dropped my keys onto the kitchen counter and exhaled slowly, willing my body to relax, to reset itself into the woman I was. But then I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, and the truth stared back at me. My lips were still swollen from Ryan's kisses. My skin was flushed, my blouse slightly re-wrinkled, the weight of night still clinging to me like an invisible mark. I felt like a stranger in my own home. A knock at the door made me jump, my pulse skipping in panic. I wasn't ready to face anyone. I wasn't ready to face myself. But when I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. Ryan. He stood there, shoulders tense, his hazel eyes burning into mine with an intensity that made my stomach flip. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to follow me home. Panic shot through me. Ryan, what are you doing here? My voice was barely above a whisper. His jaw clenched. You left without saying goodbye. I swallowed hard. I had to. Ryan's eyes darkened. No, you didn't. I stepped outside quickly, shutting the door behind me before my neighbors could see. This was dangerous. I can't do this, I whispered, wrapping my arms around myself. A barrier, a shield. Ryan took a step closer. Do what? His voice was quiet, but there was something raw beneath the surface. Talk about what happened? Acknowledge it? I shook my head, fighting back the ache in my chest. We made a mistake. Ryan's expression hardened. A mistake? His tongue darted out, running over his lower lip in frustration. Is that what last night was to you? I squeezed my eyes shut, my nails biting into my palms. Ryan, please. No. His voice was sharper now, filled with something dangerously close to hurt. You don't get to just walk away from this like it was nothing. My breath hitched. It has to be nothing. Ryan let out a bitter chuckle, raking a hand through his messy, slept-in hair. That's not what it felt like to me. A lump formed in my throat, making it hard to breathe. It doesn't matter how it felt. The hell it doesn't. His words were sharp, cutting through my defenses like a blade. I turned away, wrapping my arms tighter around myself, my entire body on the verge of collapse. This is wrong, I whispered, barely able to say the words. I have a husband. Ryan took another step forward, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "A husband who doesn't love you," he murmured. "A husband who doesn't see you the way I do." A strangled sound escaped my throat. "Ryan, stop. Tell me I'm wrong." His voice was lower now, softer, like a plea. I clenched my jaw, refusing to look at him. "You can't," he said, and I could hear the certainty in his voice. Tears burned behind my eyes. "This isn't fair," I whispered. Ryan exhaled slowly, his fingers grazing mine so lightly, so carefully, as if testing if I would pull away. I didn't. His touch was a silent question, and my lack of resistance was the answer. "Alicia," he murmured, his voice so full of something I couldn't afford to name. I finally looked at him, and what I saw in his eyes undid me completely. It wasn't just lust, wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. "I don't regret last night," he said, "and I don't think you do either." I opened my mouth, but nothing, because he was right. I didn't regret it. I regretted that I wanted more. Ryan lifted a hand, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch was so gentle, so impossibly tender, I felt my knees threaten to buckle. "You deserve to be happy," he murmured. A tear slipped down my cheek. "And what if happiness is impossible?" Ryan's jaw tensed, his hand lingering against my cheek for a fraction of a second longer before he finally, reluctantly, let it fall away. Then I guess I'll just have to convince you otherwise." My chest tightened painfully. "Ryan." He stepped back, giving me space, but his eyes never left mine. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own thought. Ryan was right. This wasn't over. And the scariest part? I didn't want it to be. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty sidewalk where Ryan had just walked away. My hands trembled at my sides, my body still humming with the aftermath of his touch, his words, his presence. I had told myself I could leave it behind, that last night was a mistake, one I could bury deep and never let resurface. But Ryan wasn't letting me forget. The door behind me creaked slightly as I pushed it open, stepping back into the house that had felt like a prison for so long. The air inside was stale, suffocating, nothing like the heat and electricity I had felt in Ryan's arms. I was supposed to be relieved to be home, to be back in my reality, my marriage, my role as Mark's wife. But now, standing in my own living room, I felt like a stranger in my own life. Mark's suitcase still sat by the front door, right where he had left it when he went on his business trip. I swallowed hard, moving on autopilot as I stepped toward it, my fingers brushing over the handle. This was my life. Not last night, not Ryan. I clenched my jaw and pushed away the thought, forcing myself to move. I needed a shower. I needed to wash last night off of me before Mark came home. The water was scalding as it poured over me, but no matter how hard I scrubbed, I could still feel Ryan's hands on my skin. I could still hear his voice in my head. "Isn't it just a moment to me? It's never been just a moment." I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my forehead against the cool tile of the shower wall. Why did it have to feel so real? I should have felt guilt, the kind that ate you alive, but instead, all I felt was loss. I had never felt more alive than I had in Ryan's arms, and now, back in my cold, lifeless house, I felt empty. By the time I stepped out of the shower and changed into fresh clothes, Mark had already called twice. I hesitated before picking up. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral, normal, like nothing had changed. "Hey, babe," he said, his voice distant, distracted as always. Flight got delayed, but I should be home in a couple of hours. My stomach twisted. I wasn't ready to see him. I wasn't ready to look him in the eye and pretend I was still the same woman I was before last night. Okay, I murmured, gripping the phone tighter. Mark sighed on the other end. How was your night? You stayed at Ryan's pretty late. I froze. My heart stopped. The words felt loaded, like he knew more than he was letting on. For a split second, panic shot through me. Did he suspect something? Had someone seen me leaving this morning? I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe. Yeah, I said carefully. Emma had a rough night. I stayed longer to help. There was a long pause, and then Mark exhaled. That's good of you. He sounded relieved, or maybe bored. The moment passed, but my hands were still shaking. Mark cleared his throat. Look, I know I've been away a lot lately. When I get back, maybe we should do something, just the two of us. I closed my eyes, waiting for a spark of something, but there was nothing, not even relief. Sounds nice, I lied. I'll see you soon, he said before hanging up. I stared at my phone for a long moment before placing it face down on the counter. This was what I had wanted, right? Mark making an effort? So why did I feel like it was too late? Later that evening, I spent the next few hours cleaning, trying to distract myself, to scrub away the weight of last night. But the more I tried to push it down, the more it clung to me. By the time Mark walked through the door, suitcase in hand, I felt like a shell of myself. Hey, he said, stepping inside. I turned, forcing a smile. Hey. He leaned in, pressing a kiss to my cheek. It felt foreign, out of place. I waited for my body to react, for my pulse to jump the way it had with Ryan. Nothing. Mark pulled back, dropping his keys onto the counter. You okay? I swallowed, nodding. Yeah, just tired. He studied me for a second, his brow furrowing slightly. Something feels different. My stomach dropped. Mark wasn't the most observant man, but after 10 years of marriage, he could tell when something was off. I turned away, busying myself with wiping down the counter. Just a long night with Emma, I said, keeping my voice light. Mark didn't push. He never did. Instead, he moved past me, heading toward the bedroom. I exhaled slowly, my hand tightening around the cloth in my grip. It should have been a relief that he didn't suspect anything. But the fact that he didn't know me well enough to push for answers made me want to scream. A message that changes everything. It was past midnight when I finally climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ryan. I saw the way his fingers traced my skin, the way his voice had trembled when he said my name. I bit my lip, turning onto my side, my heart twisting violently in my chest. I reached for my phone, my fingers hovering over Ryan's name. I shouldn't. I knew that. But the need to hear from him, to feel connected to him even through a screen, was overwhelming. Before I could stop myself, I typed out a message. Me. I can't stop thinking about last night. I hovered over the send button, my heart pounding. One push and everything would spiral again. But before I could decide, my phone vibrated in my hand. A message. From Ryan. I swallowed hard before opening it. Ryan, I can't stop thinking about you. A shaky breath left my lips. I should have put the phone down. I should have let this end before it ruined me. But instead, I typed 3 words that would seal my fate. Me, I need you. The moment I hit send, a shiver ran through me, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something far more dangerous. Relief. I had spent the entire day trying to convince myself that I could forget Ryan, that I could return to my old life, my marriage, my responsibilities. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had already left that life behind the moment I let Ryan touch me. The phone vibrated in my hands, the response coming almost instantly. I'm outside. My breath hitched. What? I shot up in bed, my hands trembling as I pulled the curtains back just enough to see. And there he was, standing in the shadows at the end of my driveway, his phone still in his hand, his gaze locked on my bedroom window. My pulse skipped, then pounded. He looked different in the dim glow of the street lamp, brooding, intense, waiting for me. I turned to check if Mark was still asleep. He was. His back was to me, his breathing slow and even, completely unaware that I was falling apart inside. Slipping out of bed, I moved on instinct, as if some invisible force was pulling me toward the door. My bare feet made no sound against the wooden floor as I tiptoed down the hallway, my heart hammering so loud I was afraid it would wake the whole house. I stepped outside, into the cool night air, into the gravity of Ryan's presence, into the irreversible moment I had been hurtling toward since last night. Ryan's eyes locked onto mine the second I closed the door behind me. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. I swallowed hard, wrapping my arms around myself as if that could contain the storm brewing inside me. "Ryan, what are you doing here?" My voice was barely above a whisper. He took a step closer. "You said you needed me." I did. God help me, I did. But that didn't make it right. I shook my head, trying to find the words that would undo this, that would send him away before we destroyed each other. Ryan moved before I could finish, closing the distance between us in 3 long strides. His hands gripped my face, his fingers threading into my hair, his body so close I could feel the heat radiating off of him. I gasped, but I didn't pull away. His thumb traced the edge of my jaw, his touch delicate despite the storm in his eyes. "Tell me you don't want this," he whispered, his breath mingling with mine. I opened my mouth, but the words never came, because I couldn't lie. Ryan exhaled sharply, his forehead pressing against mine for a brief, fleeting second. "Alicia," he murmured, my name sounding like a prayer. I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to hold on to the last shred of sanity I had left. "This is wrong," I whispered, but even as I said it, my body leaned into him. Ryan's grip on me tightened. "Then why does it feel like the only thing that's ever been right?" I didn't have an answer. His lips hovered over mine, so close that if I moved even a fraction of an inch, I would be lost. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice raw, thick with something I wasn't ready to name. "I don't want..." Neither did I. His hand slid down, resting against the small of my back, pulling me against him, forcing me to feel the tension between us, the desire, the need, the ache. I inhaled sharply, my hands gripping his jacket, torn between running and surrendering completely. "You have to go," I whispered, though my grip on him only tightened. Ryan's jaw clenched. "Say you don't want me, and I will." I couldn't. Silence stretched between us, thick, charged, suffocating. And then, as if something inside me finally snapped, I closed the distance. The second my lips touched his, Ryan let out a sharp, almost broken sound, as if he had been waiting for this, for me, for us. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer as his mouth claimed mine, desperate, consuming. The kiss was nothing like before. It was reckless, raw, unrestrained. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was feeling. His fingers dug into my hips, his body pressing me back until my spine met the cool surface of the front door. My breath hitched, my fingers threading through his hair, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss, deepening everything. Ryan groaned against my lips, his hands roaming, memorizing, needing. A door creaked. He froze. Panic shot through me like ice in my veins as I turned toward the sound, the front light flickering on, the faint rustling of movement inside the house. My Ryan's grip on me tightened protectively, his breathing ragged, his body still pressed against mine. "Shit," he murmured under his breath. I shoved him back, my pulse slamming against my ribs, my brain screaming at me to fix this before it was too late. "You have to go," I hissed, my eyes wide with panic. Ryan hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the house, then back to me, his jaw clenched, his frustration, his longing, his need written all over his face. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low, deadly serious. And then he was gone. I barely had time to catch my breath before the door behind me swung open. Alicia?" Mark's voice was groggy, laced with confusion. I turned, forcing a smile that felt like glass shattering inside me. "Hey," I managed, my voice too thin, too forced. Mark rubbed his eyes. "What are you doing out here?" My throat felt tight, clogged with lies and guilt and Ryan's lingering touch. "Couldn't sleep?" I murmured, stepping past him into the house before he could see the truth on my face. Mark didn't question it. He never did. And as I climbed back into bed beside him, my heart still racing from Ryan's kiss, from his touch, from the undeniable truth that I couldn't escape anymore, I realized something terrifying. This was only the beginning. Lying in bed beside Mark, I felt like I was suffocating. His breathing was slow, steady, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I stared at the ceiling, my body still thrumming with the memory of Ryan's touch, his lips, the way he had looked at me like I was something he couldn't bear to lose. This wasn't over. I knew it the second he whispered those words before disappearing into the night. And the most terrifying part? I didn't want it to be. I turned my head slightly, watching Mark's sleeping face in the dim light. This was my husband, the man I had shared my life with for over a decade, the man I had vowed to love, to honor, to be faithful to. But when was the last time I had felt anything for him? When was the last time I had ached for his touch, the way I did for Ryan's? I bit my lip hard, guilt sinking its claws into me. This wasn't just about desire, about passion. It was about something deeper, something I had been pretending didn't exist for far too long. I was unhappy. I had been for years. And Ryan? Ryan had made me feel alive again. I inhaled sharply and sat up, my body moving before my mind could catch up. My hands were shaking as I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Mark. I needed air. I needed Ryan. God help me, I needed him. Slipping on my robe, I padded quietly out of the bedroom and into the hallway, my heart hammering as I reached for my phone. One text, that's all it would take. But before I could type a single word, my phone vibrated in my hands. "Ryan." I sucked in a breath, my fingers tightening around the device as I stared at his name on the screen. He knew. Somehow he knew I was thinking about him. I hesitated for half a second before stepping into the bathroom and locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I answered. "Ryan," I whispered. He exhaled, his breath ragged, strained. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "I kept thinking about you." I closed my eyes, pressing my forehead against the cool surface of the mirror. "Me too." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. "Come to me," Ryan finally said, his voice low, pleading, filled with something that made my stomach twist. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But was I really ready for what that meant? "Ryan, I know you're scared," he interrupted, his voice softer now. "But you don't belong there anymore, Alicia." Tears pricked my eyes. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan was quiet for a moment before saying, "Yes, you do." A sharp knock at the bathroom door made me jump. "Alicia!" Mark's voice was groggy, confused. Panic shot through me like ice in my vein. "I have to go," I whispered, my voice shaky, uncertain. Ryan exhaled, a slow, resigned sound. "Okay." I hesitated, my fingers clenching the phone so tightly I thought it might break. "This isn't over," he murmured, echoing the words he had said earlier. A sharp pang hit my chest. "I know." I ended the call, my heart racing as I unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway. Mark stood there, rubbing his eyes, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile that felt like a lie. "Couldn't sleep." He studied me for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. Did he know? I forced myself to meet his gaze, to act like nothing was wrong, to act like I wasn't thinking about another man. Mark sighed and nodded. "Come back to bed." I hesitated, my fingers digging into my palms. And then, without another word, I followed him back into the bedroom. I lay beside him, my body still, my mind anything but. Because as I stared at the ceiling, one thought consumed me. I couldn't live like this anymore. The next morning, I woke before Mark, the weight of my decision pressing down on me like a lead blanket. I couldn't pretend anymore. Not after what happened with Ryan, not after the way I had felt in his arms. I stepped out of bed carefully, my heart racing as I grabbed my phone and slipped into the kitchen. Ryan's message was already waiting for me. "Ryan, I meant what I said. Come to me." I sucked in a shaky breath, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. If I did this, there was no going back. I glanced toward the bedroom, where Mark was still asleep. This was my chance. I took a deep breath, and then, before I could talk myself out of it, I typed my response. "Me. I'm coming." And just like that, my life was about to change forever. As I stepped out the door, leaving behind the world I had known for over a decade, I felt both terrified and exhilarated. I had spent so long convincing myself that I was content, that I could live in a marriage that had lost all its warmth. But Ryan had shown me what it felt like to be wanted, cherished, alive. I wasn't naive. I knew that what I was doing was reckless, that the fallout from this choice would be messy, painful, inescapable. But for the first time in years, I was choosing myself. As I drove toward Ryan, my heart pounding with anticipation, I wondered, was I running away from my past or running toward my future? Only time would tell.